Hello, AP World, AP Psychology students. Welcome to part 3 of memory. I'm going to start today with a memory test. These are the state capitals. A couple of them are obscured by my picture here, but if you can, and go ahead and pause this, see if you can write down the capitals of Alaska, New Mexico, South Dakota, Missouri, Kansas, Delaware, North Carolina, Vermont, Washington, and Wyoming. Go ahead and pause and see how many you can recall. Okay, so some of you might have found this rather difficult. I found that the average correct usually in my class is about 3. Now I'm going to ask you to give it a try using the first letter. And let's see. Okay, now you're going to go ahead and give it a try using the first letter. So for number 1, J, 2, SF, South Dakota is P, Missouri, JC, Kansas, T, Delaware, D, North Carolina, R, Vermont, M, Washington, O, Wyoming, C. Now go ahead and pause the video for a second, or for a minute, and see if you can remember any of these states, capitals. Okay, so if you're like most people, you will have found it easier to remember the capital with the first letter of the capital's name. So it was in your brain, but you didn't have a good retrieval cue to get the name of the capital. So I'm going to go through these quickly. Let's see how you did. Juneau for number 1, Santa Fe for 2, number 3 is Pierre, Missouri is Jefferson City. Some people say Jackson City, but it's Jefferson City. 5 is Topeka, 6 is Delaware, 7 is Raleigh, Vermont's Montpelier, 9 for Washington is Olympia, and Wyoming is Cheyenne. Now, if you're like most of my students in class, you probably got a little more correct on the trial with the first letter. This is because the first letter acted as a retrieval cue. So our third part on memory is about retrieval, the process of accessing stored information. The retrieval cues are prompts that trigger the recall of information stored in the long-term memory. For example, using the alphabet to help you recall something. But this is a trick that I learned a long time ago, and many of my students have said they've started doing this. Say you're trying to remember someone's name, or you're trying to remember the answer on a test. You start going through the alphabet, A, B, C, D. Now, what is that part of the brain that has to do with learning and memory? F, G, H. Oh, hippocampus. It's the hippocampus. So using the first letter of the alphabet is a wonderful retrieval cue. So I'm going to talk today about things that impact retrieval. And the next thing I'm going to do is give you another test. This is another memory test. I'm going to read to you a list of words. I'm going to ask you to pause and write down as many as you can recall. So I'm going to say ready. I'm going to read the list of words, and then I'm going to say write. Okay? Ready? Thread, pin, eye, injection, syringe, sewing, sharp, point, hurt, knitting, prick, haystack, pain. Right. Pause the recording. Okay, now go ahead and take a look at how many of the words that you got correct from this memory test. Here are the words that I said. If you're like most people, like we learned yesterday, we have a capacity short-term memory of 7 plus or minus 2 items, and you probably got 7 plus or minus 2. Now, were there any words that weren't actually there that you wrote down? My guess is that most, if not all of you, wrote down this word, needle. In my testing class, it is shocking to me how many people write down the word needle, because I never said the word. If you did write this down, then you have created in your mind a false memory. what this illustrates for us is something really powerful in memory called a schema. And because all of the other words fit the schema for needle, it is likely that most of you wrote that down. And I'm sorry about that. It kind of freaks some people out that I was able to somehow create this false memory for you, but it does also illustrate the power of schema. It also illustrates another concept in retrieval. This is what the chart normally looks like, and I really apologize for my really sloppier than normal handwriting, but you can see that people remember things from the beginning of the list and the end of the list the best, with the exception of needle, which pretty much everyone remembered seeing, but I never actually said. So what does this tell us about memory? First of all, it illustrates something called the serial position effect. We do tend to retrieve information more easily from the beginning and the end of a list or interview or a performance, etc. When you are going to a job interview, the thing that you want to do, and this is what I used to work on with my clients, because they had a lot of barriers to employment, especially, like if you have a felony, that's a really hard thing to overcome. But the best thing that you can do when you go to an interview is you can be clean, dress a step above what you're normally going to dress for in that job. Look the person who's interviewing you in the eye, introduce yourself, and give a good handshake. Although nowadays we're not shaking hands so much, but maybe when this coronavirus is over, or maybe that will permanently change. But nevertheless, at least introduce yourself and look the person in the eye. This is called the primacy effect. We remember both the first items in a list and our first impressions. Why do we do this? Because we have time to rehearse it. We think about it. Those first few words, thread, pin, and eye, a lot of people remember those first few words that I said on the list because they get to think about them in their mind. And that's true with making a first impression on a person as well, like in an interview. So you shake their hand, you sit down, they have time to think about their first impressions of you as they go sit down to prepare for the interview. The recency effect is the idea that remember the last items in a list or our final impressions. Why does this happen? Let's say you go to a concert and, maybe there's some mistakes in the middle, but the ending is a glorious chord. Everything is perfect. And then you walk away from the concert, you go, wow, that was like the most beautiful thing ever. So what you're doing is you're rehearsing or you're thinking about that information that that impression that you made while you just finished listening to this stunning musical performance. And likewise, when you say goodbye to someone, and if you do it in a good and positive way, they're going to think to themselves, oh, this is a good impression. So it's really important for you guys as you go out into the world, when you can go out into the world again, to make good first impressions and good last impressions, because those are the ones that last. Another thing that affects our retrieval is something called the encoding specificity principle. That's a hard word to say. So the more closely the cues match our original learning conditions, the more likely it is that retrieval will occur. So normally, if you're in my class and we are learning something, and I pull out one of my dolls, or I point at something on the wall or the board, you have what's called the context effect, and you're more likely to remember that information if you're in the context that you learned it. So the setting that you learned it. The reason why I have this picture of a random person under the water is that psychologists did a study where they had students learn a list of words under the water and on the beach. When they tested the students later on, the ones that were retested did better if they had to recall the words when they were in the original place that they learned them, whether it was underwater or on the beach. Another thing that is part of this principle is something called the mood congruence effect. That feeling when you're happy and you're with friends and you're talking about happy things, that elicits, that mood elicits in our brain, it activates those happy memories. The same thing happens when we're depressed. If we are in a depressed mood, we get down, we continue to go further and further down because that mood itself acts as a retrieval cue for those sad and depressing memories. This is really important to keep in mind when we get to talking about depression. And then your physical or chemical state can even be part of the encoding specificity principle. Let's say you have drank alcohol and you did something while you were drinking alcohol, you don't really think about it much, and then when you drink alcohol again, which none of you should be doing because you're not 21 yet, but those memories of when you were intoxicated might come back to you while you're intoxicated again. It also happens with something like marijuana or even a physical state like having a fever or something like that. So see if you can think of an example of the encoding and specificity principle. Finally, why do we have retrieval cue problems sometimes? We just have inadequate or missing retrieval cues. So when you have an inadequate or missing retrieval cue, try to think of things, like I said, the alphabet, or access other information related to what you're trying to retrieve, and then maybe you can retrieve that information. Recognition, multiple choice tests are generally thought to be easier than free recall tests because of multiple choice tests, you're matching an answer with something already in your memory. And that's why for a lot of people, if we do like an FRQ, it's a good idea to do the multiple choice test first because that's going to act as a retrieval cue for you before you do the FRQ. The other thing a phenomenon that happens is something called the tip of the tongue experience. This is when you know that there is that memory, you know the answer to a question, and you just can't access the memory. We call that the tip of the tongue experience. And you know what happens? It's like you get out of the test, and what happens? You remember the information that you couldn't remember during the test. It's a very common phenomenon. I'm going to try to talk very quickly about these two special kinds of memory for this particular recording. So, flashbulb memory is an extremely vivid memory of an emotionally significant moment or event. I can tell you, I'll try to do it very quickly. So I was 19. I just transferred from Duluth to the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. My roommate's dad knew a guy who had also transferred from Duluth to the Twin Cities campus. So my roommate's dad and this guy's dad got together and they said, hey, Lori should go over and meet Keith. So Lori said, oh, my dad is not going to get off my back unless I go meet this Keith guy. Will you come with me? So I did, and we knocked on the door, and I remember this guy opening the door, and he had sort of, shoulder-length blonde hair. He was really tan, dark blue jersey, light blue corduroys. He was eating a can of Van Camp's beans with the top opened up a little bit. Now, and there was water on his shirt. I have such a vivid memory of this event. Why? Because it was him right there, the man who would become my husband, and that's me as a 19-year-old. So you can still see Raggedy Ann and Andy, and I have Snoopy. At any rate, that is a flashbulb memory. Many people have flashbulb memories of certain really highly significant events in their life. Some people have something called eidetic imagery. This is a photographic memory, and this is a very rare ability to maintain exactly detailed images. So keep in mind, flashbulb memories can change or be distorted. This is why when you're maybe with a family member and you're talking about, remember when XYZ happened, and some of you might have slightly different recollections of that memory. That's because flashbulb memories are subject to that same process I've talked about before. They become firm in a couple of days, and they are subject to becoming distorted with post-event information. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to go, and by the way, this is just a little piece of information, occurs in 8% of pre-adolescent children, and then as our brains develop, we lose this ability. Now, what I'm going to do is, on our next lesson, we are going to be looking at these concepts. I'm going to have you watch a video, and I'm going to assign some reading pages about the misinformation effect and imagination inflation. These are really, really important concepts. I'm not going to cover them on video. I'm going to, like I said, put it in your next assignment and have you watch a video about a man who was wrongly accused of sexual assault. So thank you very much for your attention and for all of your work. This is a new experience for all of us. I appreciate you all. Thank you.